Hey everyone, and welcome to the the Dissenter Weekly for this week. Totally blew that open, but I've gotten it every single time since.
I know, right?
Here, we'll do it again, just like nothing happened. I'm Kevin Gostola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com. We have a full slate of whistleblower stories for you this week for June 18th, 2020. But first, from Brian.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. It's good to be back with you. Just a regular reminder to please follow us on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. For our work, please consider making a donation at shadowproof.com/donate. Why don't we jump right in here, Kevin? Our first story is that mid-level bureaucrats fuel climate change denial in government agencies. What's the story here?
Hey, sorry, we had a little connection issue.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, part of the problem was a connection issue. So
okay.
I think we've got that resolved. And we'll keep pressing onward. So here, our first story for this week is this piece. It's a report that came from the New York Times that looks at climate change denial within the U.S. government, which we know has been proliferating under President Donald Trump. There's been efforts to have words like climate change and also references to aspects of climate change, removal of mentions of policies, including from the Obama administration era, like the Clean Power Plan, which contributed to phasing out coal plants. And so this report primarily focuses on what I think the impact has been to this top-down policy of suppressing information. You now have bureaucrats at the mid-level that are going along to get along and have decided that they're going to keep certain information from their own reports or their own research that they contribute to their work in the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies. This extends to work that people might be doing in the National Park Service or in the Department of the Interior. And it points out in this report multiple examples of people we could call whistleblowers who have tried to go against the grain of what is allowed when it comes to research. But then also we have an example. We have a reference to an Inspector General's report at the Environmental Protection Agency that was made public in May, which found that almost 400 employees surveyed in 2018 believed a manager had interfered with or suppressed the release of scientific information, but they never reported the violations. There's a separate Union of Concerned Scientists survey in 2018 of more than 63,000 federal employees across 16 agencies that identified the EPA and the Department of Interior as having the least trustworthy leadership in matters of scientific integrity. And Maria Caffrey, who is a former geography specialist at the National Park Service, fought her own managers as they tried to remove information related to how humans were responsible for climate change, how they were the reason why sea levels were rising. She herself has a very good quote in the New York Times piece where she says they're doing it because they're scared. That fact that these mid-level bureaucrats are not challenging their superiors anymore. She says these are all people who went to the March for Science rallies, but then they got into the office on Monday and completely rolled over. And so you might remember that I think it was 2 years ago, there was a March for Science. 2 or 3 years ago, there was a March for Science. We were inspired, we were led to think that there were people within these institutions that were going to fight back against Donald Trump. I think this was about the time that we were also seeing on Twitter that there were these anonymous accounts that supposedly represented anonymous employees within these agencies that were going to dissent against Trump administration. But what we're seeing is that it's exhausting. It's really hard to keep fighting day in and day out to challenge what's happening. And that what's unfortunate is because these bureaucrats are unwilling to keep up this struggle, that we're going to continue to lose ground while Donald Trump is president, and then while this kind of climate denial science continues to have sway within these agencies.
Thank you, Kevin. Why don't you keep it going with our next story? I'm going to try to fix my connection.
Okay. All right. So we have this. It's kind of a follow-up. We've been talking about the FAA ever since we started the show, giving you updates on its issues when it comes to allowing Boeing to produce the 737 MAX that had significant problems, which resulted in the crashes of their airliners, a couple really horrible crashes. The FAA, according to the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, is not responding to requests for information about their training and the certification of inspectors. So we don't know that aircraft are being properly investigated. We know that the aircraft certification process failed or didn't conduct proper oversight, and that meant that the fatal flaws in Boeing's 737 MAX airliner were able to be in the airplane, and that airplane was allowed to take off. Airplanes like it were allowed to take off, and there wasn't anything done to ensure that they were safe for passengers. The Mississippi Republican Roger Wicker, who chairs this committee, says that he has requested information that relate to allegations of whistleblower retaliation by senior agency managers. He wants information about the 737 Boeing MAX, and yet they have refused to give him what he is asking for. That's obviously a problem because people want to know if they are going to fly, that they're going to get on airplanes that don't have the same problems that the Boeing 737 MAX had. And a previous issue, something that people really need to consider, is that the family of the crash victims, we're talking about a 2019 crash, criticized previous legislation for failing to prohibit aircraft manufacturers from directly influencing the 737 airplane certification process. So, essentially Boeing has been allowed to have a seat at the table on what it's going to allow as far as oversight goes and how they could limit inspectors to get in there. And they would probably argue that you're interfering with our business, but those inspectors are there to protect people and ensure safety.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move to our next story, and I should be all set by then. What's this bill that was introduced for whistleblowers?
Yeah, and we apologize for some of the hiccups. It's a less than smooth show for this week. But there was a bill that was introduced by senators. There's also a bill in the House to protect whistleblowers who are revealing or have information related to how COVID-19 relief funds are being abused. Essentially, you've got most of the prominent senators who are Democrats, liberal Democrats, that have signed on in support of it. People like Kamala Harris, Ron Wyden, Bernie Sanders is supportive of this legislation. And this, if passed, would institute they would hope that it would allow for protections for employees or former employees who worked at places that received these funds, so they could come forward and reveal how funds were abused, that disclosures would be protected. If there was evidence of gross mismanagement or waste, dangers to public health or safety, if there were abuses of authority or violations of the law, it would create some kind of a legal framework so that people could come to the Department of Labor and have them investigate whistleblower retaliation claims. And then if administrative relief was not timely provided, then whistleblowers could have access to jury trials and being able to go to a federal court. That would be huge because for the most part, these kinds of pieces of legislation have always lacked that component where someone would have the recourse to go to a court and fight for their claims to be legitimized. So this is an important bill. It also would attempt to protect whistleblower confidentiality and protect against gag orders that might be imposed against these employees, whether they are current or former employees. Public Citizen is this nonprofit that does a lot of work doing watchdog work when it comes to malfeasance and misconduct by government agencies. And their statement is basically that we know that large profitable corporations are taking these funds and they're not using them to protect workers, but to line their own pockets, since the administration is trying to hide information about who is getting small business funds. Whistleblowers are even more important to rooting out wrongdoing related to the bailout. And we did a story at Shadowproof that looked into, or we published a story that looked into how Congress people have been taking these small business loans. So it's kind of odd that essentially you could have an odd situation where Congress might be passing legislation where they don't really have an incentive to pass it because people might blow the whistle against their abuse of funds if those employees would know that they had obtained these small business loans and shouldn't have them. But more specifically, the issue is that Steve Mnuchin at the Treasury Department and Donald Trump basically made it certain that there wasn't any oversight of this money. And they even issued a signing statement that removed the ability of Congress to really be involved in determining how oversight was conducted. So there's $3 or $4 trillion, if not more, that's just being doled out to corporations. And then there's money that's being appropriated to Small Business Administration. And so there's really next to no transparency at the moment on how this money is being used. And so this is an opportunity for Congress to put something in place that would empower employees to give us that transparency that is being denied by the Trump administration.
Thank you, Kevin. Hopefully it's a little better connection here. You can let me know if you can hear me any better.
I can see you clearly, so that's good.
Okay. Good. Sorry to everybody watching as well. I appreciate your patience. This next story is incredibly outrageous. You sent me the complaint for this week when we were working on pulling the report together. What is this story? It involves our friend John Kiriakou. We have Northrop Grumman accused of fueling revenge porn allegations against CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou. What is this story?
Yeah, so essentially, John's ex-wife, Heather, works for Northrop Grumman and is a director of global business development. She's not the director of Northrop Grumman, but she is one of the directors, and she's a director of global business development. And this civil lawsuit that was brought in court challenges a chain of events that happened to John Kiriakou because he was going through a really rough patch when it came to his relationship and marriage to Heather. He found out that she was cheating on him, and the allegations in the lawsuit is that he had found this evidence that she was traveling on using funds that are supposed to be business funds from Northrop Grumman, and those funds were being abused. And she was traveling around the world with this man that they were cheating on him. And so he called up the Northrop Grumman ethics office. He had documentation that this was happening, and he wanted to let Northrop Grumman know that that there was a violation. The ethics office, according to the civil lawsuit, informed him that he should submit whatever documents he had, and then they would pass it on to the superiors, and they would deal with it accordingly. And allegedly, the Northrop Grumman management turned around and provided this information to Heather. And then Heather, because one of the, at least one or two of the images showed her wearing a bikini, a bikini that included a thong, she turned around and created this allegation that John had committed revenge porn, and took it to a detective. Got a detective at the Arlington County Police Department to support her and work with her. And so then John Bamford, who is named in the complaint, allegedly got this army of police to go to John's house in Arlington and to raid it. And at first he was charged. First, he was hit with 2 counts of illegal dissemination of photographs in August 2019. But then subsequently, in October 11th, there were search warrants that were put together, and they rested upon this fabrication, which the lawsuit claims Bamford knew. And then they came and conducted search warrants on John's person, his vehicles, and his home. The lawsuit alleges violated his Fourth Amendment rights to privacy very systematically. And he had set for 7.5 hours. There was this raid that was taking place on his home. Items were being inventoried. He had his electronics taken, which John works in media. John is a journalist, and he works with others. And I don't know if he's doing the kinds of stories where confidential sources could be compromised, but there's potentially information that could have been seized by these cops that was sensitive, given what he works on. He had his most recent book was on Iran. He had covered it was called the CIA's Insider Guide to the Iran crisis, I believe. And so he was raided. And he had a scooter taken that took him several weeks to get back. And the biggest thing, the real reason why John is, I believe, pushing this lawsuit and seeking damages, and what caused him the most psychiatric distress, is that because of these concocted revenge porn allegations, the civil lawsuit alleges that Heather was then able to, during a custody battle over his 3 children, who are now ages 8, 13, and 15, she was able to use this as a factor to argue to the judge that John was not a good father. And he essentially lost contact with his children. And this was in there in the backdrop as something that she could use to gain control of John's kids.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's keep it moving here. We have a couple more stories on the docket. Our next story is out of North Carolina. I believe you just published something at Shadowproof about this. North Carolina becomes the 5th state where Ag-Gag laws have been struck down. You've been covering Ag-Gag laws for a while now. Can you tell folks a little bit about what they are and what's happening here in North Carolina?
Yeah, so Ag-Gag laws are basically these corporate-backed farm secrecy statutes that are usually passed with the intent to suppress and or criminalize anyone who is speaking out about industrial agricultural production. That could involve going and targeting whistleblowers. You can go after animal rights activists that are engaged in undercover investigations where they're seeking to take photos or record videos that can expose abuse of animals or cruelty to animals. And what happened in North Carolina is slightly different from what we've seen in other states. They had a somewhat different law, but it was still an Ag-Gag law. It essentially created a civil remedy so that private firms, companies, or even government agencies, let's say you could have a college or university that receives state funds but is involved in doing animal research, they would be able to bring a civil lawsuit against someone, whether they be a journalist, a whistleblower, a former government employee who is now speaking out, etc. They could bring this lawsuit, and then potentially someone would be fined $5,000 up to $5,000 a day. So if the violation of whatever they're claiming lasted for 10 days, they would then potentially be hit with a $50,000 fine because of the speech that they engaged in exposing whatever abuse or malfeasance they were trying to share with the public. And so a judge determined that this did implicate First Amendment issues and that it did violate the First Amendment, and stripped multiple provisions from the law. The law is still on the books, but the Judge Thomas Schroeder removed much of what targeted speech. And it's very clear that these kinds of laws are unnecessary, because what you often see when judges are raising issues about how they chill speech, or they could be used to go after whistleblowers, or they could suppress undercover investigations, that they're pointing out there were already trespassing laws on the books in these states. And a lot of times these authorities or these officials act like they're pursuing this law because they need greater ability to prevent someone from coming on their property. But, if that was really the case, then how do you explain that you do have private property laws that go against trespassing? And so usually judges can see through what is going on. We've had now, as we set this all up, there have been 5 states that have ruled these unconstitutional. There's about a half dozen or so states that do have legislation that passed. They will see challenges. But then there's several states where legislation has been proposed and defeated. And so I think the trend is actually against having these kinds of laws. So by and large, this is a good story that we're talking about, because it does seem like the groups that are fighting this are winning, even though these are long, protracted battles. And in the interim, when these laws pass, it really does discourage these organizations from engaging in any kind of work in that specific state for a set amount of time. And I highlighted an example that's specific to North Carolina, that it's good now that this law has been struck down, because maybe we'll be able to have more coverage of this issue. But the reason why this law could be useful to factory farms in North Carolina, why they might want a kind of Ag-Gag law, is because North Carolina is notorious for their pig farms, where these kinds of shit lagoons build up, and they smell like decomposing bodies, especially after storms come through. And sometimes these farms will actually spray the waste illegally, so that it doesn't spread on their own land. It contributes to runoff, and it affects everyone that lives nearby, and the states know about it, and they actively do nothing about it, and they're actually covering for industry instead of taking some kind of action. And this is why these laws matter, because having them on the books means that people are discouraged from going to the property line and taking photos and taking video and trying to uncover samples and trying to show what's going on. So it's a little bit, it isn't just about what horrid video might get posted on the internet showing a cow or a pig or a horse being beaten. It's also what kind of pollution might these farms be engaged in that people need to know about. And the reason why you fight these laws is so that you can also protect the environment.
Thank you, Kevin. Hopefully, it's become the 5th state. Hopefully it's not the last. I hope we see a lot more of these laws in the near future. Our last story involves a name that I still can't quite believe is still in politics at this point in my life. But the Justice Department is suing to block the publication of John Bolton's book. What is the story here with Mr. Bolton?
Yeah, I generally have a policy. If this is a story that's getting mainstream attention, I'll ignore it and spend some time on other things. But I can't let John Bolton off the hook, primarily because if you recall back in 2010, he was someone who vehemently believed that WikiLeaks should be treated as a kind of terrorist organization for publishing documents from Chelsea Manning. He was someone who thought Chelsea Manning committed treason. And if you listen to things that he is saying, they might sound similar to what he's going through now with the Trump administration that's trying to crack down on his book. I'll be clear. I think that as much as I think John Bolton is a complete and utter piece of shit, his book has a right to be published. But there are some issues that I want to flesh out just so that people can have a better understanding of what's going on. And I'm not sure that if you tune into CNN or MSNBC, they're going to reflect these issues because they're just so giddy and excited that a book is coming that they're all going to get to dig into and read and share amongst their social circles. And it's going to show a lot of things that they believe about Donald Trump are true. And back in 2010, John Bolton called the leaks very damaging that came from WikiLeaks. He said they undercut embassies in the field, giving honest assessments for the people back in Washington. Well, John, that's exactly what you're doing now with your book on the Trump administration. You're publishing all of this information about private conversations that took place between you and Trump officials when you were the national security advisor. And it is going to potentially be a blow to diplomacy. You are saying that Donald Trump wanted to support rounding up Uyghur Muslims in China to put them in camps. And, whether that's true or not, I mean, we're taking you at your word. But that's going to be something that has ripple effects, and Donald Trump is going to have to deal with in any conversations with China. You object to how he was pursuing the trade deal. These are things that were brought out in diplomatic cables that Chelsea Manning published, and yet John Bolton found this to be terribly offensive. He even voiced sympathy for supporting a measure that would label WikiLeaks a terrorist organization. And he went even a step farther. He said, if our cyber warfare experts need target practice, I would recommend they practice on WikiLeaks. So he was favoring cyber attacks. So, hey, John, why don't we have a cyber attack against you in order to make it impossible for you to spread the contents of your book to media? I mean, obviously, this isn't something that I support, but it just seems like the hypocrisy is palpable when it comes to John Bolton here. And I'm seeing these headlines about how there are multiple additional impeachable offenses that he believes that Trump committed outside of the alleged offense around the Ukraine call. And yet he was in a position to reveal this information when the House and the Senate were pursuing impeachment, and he didn't come forward. And it's like he had this information all along, and he was just saving it so that he could publish his book and get this kind of prestige and attention that he's getting right now. But again, like, there is a very serious issue. There is a serious issue about what this means for the First Amendment and the right to publish if the Justice Department is able to suppress a book. There was an effort that unfolded against Edward Snowden when he published his book, Permanent Record. And so now John Bolton is dealing with the same thing, but it's absolutely true. The things that the Trump administration are saying about John Bolton are absolutely true, and it does make you wonder if John Bolton, by going out and doing this, has opened himself up to an Espionage Act prosecution because he had these private conversations, and there's no way that the contents that he's sharing from his book are not sensitive, classified information. And yet he's probably, because we have this double standard for elites, going to be able to go about his business and not get in trouble at all. Meanwhile, Reality Winner sits in a federal prison in Texas, in Fort Worth, Texas, and she had the same idea. She believed that she was exposing something that people needed to know about the Trump administration, and now she is completing a sentence that was multiple years long, and she is facing the threat of becoming infected by the coronavirus, and has been trying, but thus far failed to convince a district court to release her so that she does not die from the coronavirus in prison. So it's you'll excuse me if I find it a little obnoxious that John Bolton is on my TV screen. The same person who said that we should bomb Iran is on our TV screen, and we're now holding him up as some kind of hero and also allowing him to spread all of this information without dealing with the fact that he was completely opposed to somebody engaging in this kind of, I'm not saying it's dishonorable, but he was against anyone blowing the whistle on the Obama administration, or he was opposed to whistleblowers against the Bush administration. So this is all basically for his own self-important reasons that he's for sharing these details about the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, I will never forget, I think it was about 8 years ago, John Bolton suggesting that Chelsea Manning should be executed for her leaks. So just, you never know what's going to happen 10 years down the road, I guess, right? John?
I mean, it's amazing that he's on the other side, and, you hear these things that the civil lawsuit that the Justice Department filed suggests there's exceptionally great damage that will come from the publication of his book. And then I guess, meanwhile, the other thing is I want to just point out that foreign policy differences are not impeachable offenses. The fact that Donald Trump didn't agree with John Bolton on what needed to be done as far as the U.S. empire goes is not an impeachable offense. It just means that he was not beholden to a certain ideology that animates John Bolton. And so this looks like a war amongst elites that is now being fought out in the open. This book is the latest in that battle, which we've seen going. Russiagate was a war among elites. The Ukraine call whistleblower thing, whatever that was a war among elites. It takes partisan whistleblowing. And so here John Bolton is acting like he's a whistleblower against Donald Trump. And I severely question the contents of what he has to reveal as to whether they're actually focused on abuse or malfeasance by Donald Trump's administration. It seems like he has a difference of opinion on how Donald Trump should wage foreign policy. And that's the issue. He's upset that Donald Trump didn't listen to him and made him feel small. And so now we're getting this book that suggests, he was in the room where it happened, which is sort of a funny title to me because that's actually a line in a Hamilton musical. It's just like, it's very odd. It's very bizarre. So everyone, thank you for watching the show this week.
Any final thoughts, Kevin, before we part with everyone?
Well, yeah, I just want to prime people. We're going to be doing another call where we put out requests to journalists to submit stories. Last week, if you didn't catch that show, we did a show that focused on police whistleblowers and highlighted a couple examples of people who have challenged that blue wall of silence. I hope to do more work on that because I think there are several issues around police whistleblowers that are worth focusing upon as we push forward and take steps that are in line with dismantling police departments in this country. And I want you to look for this call that's going to come out. We'll be asking journalists to submit their stories so that we can publish more work around what's going on with organizing throughout the country around police. And if you are able to chip in a few dollars, because this will help us hire more journalists to contribute work to Shadowproof. So again, thank you for watching this show. Thank you for supporting us on a weekly basis. And that's all I have for this week.
Yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in and for your comments and for your patience while I run around the house and try to find a place with better internet reception.
Well, I'm not able to introduce the show.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you. And we'll have that open call. We'll explain more about what we'll be working on. So very grateful for all the support that we've received for the COVID-19 reporting that we were doing and will continue to do. But for now, if you could please just follow us on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and all of those places. Just stay up to date with us so that you don't miss any of our reporting. And again, if you can chip in, shadowproof.com/donate, even a couple dollars helps. So thank everyone out there, and please stay safe, and we will see you next week.